Greetings, cretins. Now, Warhammer Fantasy may be a dead setting, until the old world brings it back, that is, but just like 40k, it managed to produce some cool and interesting characters. From Nagash, the Undying King, to Fassbinder the Strong, a halfling who managed to escape the hellscape that is Skavenblight. There are a bunch of notable and memorable characters that I could go on and on about in Warhammer Fantasy. But you're not here for lengthy, boring stories, are you? No. You, my friend, are here because you clicked on the title, or the thumbnail, or some mix of both, to see which characters from Warhammer Fantasy battles stand even a remote chance at surviving in the 40k grimdark universe, as 40k is a darker, broader setting, with technology that eclipses even the most crafty Skaven engineer. It would be hard for any person from a medieval fantasy universe to even last a day in the grimdark far future. Of course, we could say that any character could technically survive, so long as they were popped down into an imperial planet and lived out the rest of their days as a menial worker, but we don't want to see Karl Franz join the office now, do we? There are two ways I'm judging the entries in this list. Firstly, I'm looking at whether they'd be able to essentially play the same role as they would in Warhammer Fantasy, i.e. would Grimgor be able to lead a war, for example, would Boris Todbringer be able to dedicate his life to hunting some Bestigor? Also, secondly, I'm looking at how well they'd get on. Like sure, Karl Franz's political mind could get him places, but as a normal human without a second heart or power armor, he's hardly going to thrive, he's not going to reach his emperor status. Got the idea? Good. Let's get started. Also, I'm going to try and avoid gods on this list, such as Sigmar, simply because otherwise I'd basically be making a top 5 most powerful Warhammer Fantasy characters list. The first entry that came to my mind when I was making this list was Oxytocil. Now, a small chameleon skink may not make as much immediate sense as some of the other entries on this list, but I think when you take a closer look at Oxytocil's CV, you'll see he's more than qualified to live in the 40k universe. First off, we can look at Oxytocil for what he is, a chameleon skink, to see how he'd survive. Skinks are part of the lizardmen race of Warhammer Fantasy, and make up the majority of its skirmishing forces, though skinks can basically be what they want to be in fantasy, acting as magical supports by becoming a star priest or taming lustrous mighty dinosaurs. Chameleon skinks are sort of an evolution from that, as they can use their camouflage abilities to blend in anywhere and practically become invisible. Already, these stealth skills make Oxytocil a prime candidate for surviving in the 40k universe, because so long as he can mask his appearance and prepare for those who see him with other forms of detection beyond their peepers, he should be okay. Does this mean that any chameleon skink could do well in the grimdark far future of the Warhammer 40k universe? Not likely. Oxytocil is a special little skink, better than all his colour-shifting cousins, due to the fact that during the first war against Chaos in Warhammer Fantasy, he ended up in the realms of Chaos and survived there. All his lizardmen brethren were either killed in the transportation of his city to the realms, or were eaten by demons, with Oxytocil being the only survivor thanks to his cloaking abilities. In the realms of Chaos, Oxytocil acted as Warhammer Fantasy's Doom Guy, or I guess you could compare it to Sly Marbo if you really want a 40k comparison, essentially doing the impossible every day as he killed countless demons with his magic blowpipe. None saw him coming thanks to his invisibility, and the fact that he was always covered in demon guts to mask his smell. Even with Warhammer 40k's demons being much stronger than that of Fantasy due to there being a larger population in the setting, I still think Oxytocil will be able to do as he did in Fantasy, just killing demons, admittedly with a bit more difficulty. I'm not going to say he could stand up to a Space Marine or anything like that, but as he got used to the weaponry of the 40k universe, I could see Oxytocil doing well for himself as the ultimate demon assassin. Now, the second entry on this list is Nagash. This is more of an obvious answer, I guess, compared to Oxytocil. I've already mentioned Nagash once in this video, entitling him as the Undying King, and with a name like that, you'd like to think he can do well wherever you put him. Due to Nagash's master of necromancy and sheer magical power, I believe the Bag of Bones could do well for himself if he suddenly got transported into the 41st millennium. If we put him on a random Imperial world, I'd give it a few weeks before he's got the entire population under his control. Of course, this would likely lead to an exterminatus by the Inquisition, but Nagash's killing spree would have been fun while it lasted. My reasoning for putting Nagash on here I think is fairly standard. He's one of the most powerful mages in Warhammer Fantasy with near enough an immortal body, and of course he made Mage Kill's excellent video about fantasy characters that could kill a Primarch, so he kind of has to be put on this list, as his power alone could make him a fine fit in the universe. Hell, he even made the Chaos Gods fear him back in the old world, so surely he could be a meaningful presence even in a much wider galaxy. The only thing that would likely bring Nagash down, as it does in Fantasy, is his arrogance. If he wanted, he could prove to be a powerful force in 40k, as the more fodder the Imperium, orcs and other races send his way, the larger his army will grow. However, this skeletal beast has been felled twice already, and both times it was by mortal men, because rather than keep his guard up, Nagash falls into the typical villain trope of monologuing or believing he's won way before he already has. This arrogance was likely ensure Nagash's survival would be a short one, but if he could rein in his ego for just a short amount of time, I think he'd be able to conquer a few worlds, hopefully realising how ships work in 40k before the Inquisition find out what he's done and blow his planets to heck. Speaking of characters that would survive in 40k based on their own power level, look who's popped in! Anarion the Defender might be the most powerful mortal to have ever come out of Warhammer Fantasy. He took on 4 of the Chaos God's mightiest champions among hosts of other demons during the Great Catastrophe, the same war I mentioned in the part about Oxytocil. He made the gods and Chaos Gods beg him not to take up the Sword of Cain, only to destroy everything in his path once he picked up the weapon. I thought about putting Malekith on this list in this spot, mostly because as an Aryan reborn in the end times, I think he's got a chance either at being an interesting addition to the Eldar or the Dark Eldar factions. As you know, Malekith is a bit of a mix of political power and real magical raw power, but I couldn't really excuse putting the edgy metal boy over his papa. An Aryan, unlike Oxytocil, wouldn't survive by going unnoticed in Warhammer 40k, but I think his best chance of living in the sci-fi universe would be by getting people to notice his demon-killing abilities. Even if the Imperium found his Xenos heritage to be heretical, the Eldar would not allow such a valuable resource like an Aryan to be left alone, and would likely try all they could to bring him into their fold. With the Sword of Cain, an Aryan could get back to what he was doing in the Great Catastrophe, and perhaps he could even go further than just killing demons, and help the Eldar rebuild the pieces of Cain scattered across the galaxy. Bit of theory crafting there, bit of fanfiction, but, you know, someone like an Aryan would simply survive just because he's too much of a baller to be taken down by most threats the 40k universe can provide. Well, maybe he couldn't survive a shot from a hammerhead railgun, but, you know. Unlike an Aryan Nagash who would survive simply because of their power, I think Marathi would do well in Warhammer 40k because she could easily weave her way into a position of political power. With her looks, her magic, and her ability to make most men bend to her whim, Marathi could easily take control of an entire planet's governance, either boldly declaring herself as its new leader, or being more of a shadowy figure. While combat-wise Marathi would do okay with her magic, her lack of armour and mediocre power compared to the most magically adept figures of 40k like Magnus the Red would mean that Marathi's best chance of survival comes from who she is and her experience in manipulation. She'd gladly give her soul to Slaanesh as well, if it meant getting ahead of her opponents and gaining more power. Essentially, there's nothing really stopping Marathi from adapting to her surroundings and being the Hag Queen of 40k, similarly to how she is in fantasy. Even a trip to Comera could see Marathi climb the political ladder of the Dark Eldar. Maybe I'm reaching a bit there, but, you know, I think she'd do. Last, but certainly not least on our list, is Ikit Claw. Now, this one is quite specific, and probably the entry you're going to have to suspend your disbelief the most for, but I do think Ikit Claw, under the right circumstances, could be one of Fantasy's most suited characters to 40k. Of course, if our pal Ikit was transported to some random city in the Imperium, or on a Tau planet, or in front of Ghazghkull Thraka, or pretty much anywhere where he's not welcome, he'd either be shot dead as Xenos scum, or at best endlessly tortured as a science experiment. However, I still think as Chief Warlock Engineer of Clan Skryre, with plenty of power both in his magical and scientific abilities, he would adapt to the new technology in Warhammer 40k quicker than most individuals in Fantasy. In Warhammer Fantasy, Ikit is known for travelling far and wide to gain inspiration for his newest killing machines. From Cathay to Lustria to even infiltrating the mountains of the Chaos Dwarves, Ikit has seen it all and has produced some of the most technologically advanced creations the Warhammer universe has ever seen. The fella basically created the first atom bomb, while Bretonnia still thought swords and arrows were the most elite forms of weaponry. He's known to have learned spells and gathered technological knowledge from men, dwarves and elves, so it stands to reason that he would seek to increase his brain size in the vast galaxy of 40k. If that little rat could build on Tau or Dark Eldar technologies, he could very easily become a one-rat wrecking machine. Perhaps this isn't the character who would survive the best, as Ikit is a Skaven, there wouldn't be any faction for him to join or find safety in, and as I mentioned before, if you put him in the wrong place, he's just going to immediately explode. However, if he was left to dwell under an Imperial city, or even on the Adeptus Mechanicus homeworld of Mars, underneath it, out of sight and out of mind, In a few years, we'd likely be seeing Dark Eldar levels of tech from the Great Burned Rat. Though who he'd use this kind of invention on, no one will know. And that's the list. Obviously, this one isn't meant to be taken so seriously, it's just more of a list of characters who could survive, in my humble opinion. And of course, it's unlikely that any of them would actually survive, as the realms of 40k and fantasy are best kept separate, and you couldn't really excuse a character used to sword and shield combat surviving in a setting that has power armor and spaceships that can just destroy a planet. But hey, wasn't this a bit of fun anyway? I hope so, and sometimes that's all we need in life, just a bit of fun. Think I was completely wrong and I should throw myself into the warp? Think the only character on this list should have been Sigmar? Let me know in the comments. That's all for this one. Stay ghouling, guys and gals.